Hello, and welcome back to the world of Wysteria. Tonight, we will be reading chapter 33. This chapter will be broken into 3 parts, and part 2 will be rather short, but had to be done that way. Wysteria, chapter 33. So, she told you her name, said Jeremy, gazing at the falls. Very good. The water nymph, Will replied, as he and Emily joined him on the balcony. She didn't tell me, I just felt it. Jeremy nodded. Yes, he said. But I was speaking of Iris. Yes, I know the blonde woman's name too, said Will. That doesn't solve the mystery, though. She can't be an ordinary citizen, a product of my mind. She knew things that I didn't. But she doesn't feel like a visitor. I feel connected to her in some way. I trust her. I can't explain it. I was hoping you might have a clue. I don't know if you remember, said Emily, speaking to Jeremy, but I mentioned her to you in our first conversation about Will. Yes, he said. I remember. At the time, I had my suspicions. And now, she asked. After a long pause, Jeremy turned his back on the majestic view and asked Will to describe the various times she'd appeared to him. Eager to hear any thoughts Jeremy had concerning her identity, Will recounted their initial meeting, in which she'd pointed him to the square. He then told him about their second encounter, hearing her voice calling to him from the dark as he tried to find his way to the fountain. Then, catching a glimpse of her before she disappeared. She seemed to show up when I was lost, he said. After giving Jeremy a full account of their conversation in the garden before the fight, Will went on to explain how she'd helped distract the lookout, which he'd skipped over before. He also described, in detail, the changes he'd seen in her appearance. I saw the same thing, said Emily, just for a moment, that halo of colored light around her. And then, the way the sentry looked at her, as if he were under a spell. Jeremy sat back against the balustrade and stared at the ground. You mentioned seeing a rainbow. Yes, just before we left the ravine, said Will. It wasn't my doing, as far as I know. I also heard a voice, in my head, telling me it was a message. At first, I thought it was the naiad speaking to me. But then I realized it was her. As he reflected on the voice, a stray, seemingly unrelated thought crossed his mind. There was something that happened in the square during the battle, he said. Just before the first shot from the crossbow was fired, I felt someone touch me, lightly, on the shoulder. When I turned, no one was there. But if I hadn't moved my head when I did, the bolt would have hit me instead of the drifter. Oh my God, Emily exclaimed. You didn't tell me about that. I'd forgotten, he said. So much was going on. But now that I think about it, when I felt the touch and looked to see who it was, for some reason, I expected it to be her, Jeremy struck in. Will nodded. Yes. Well then, said Jeremy. I believe my suspicion has been confirmed. Your mysterious blonde woman is what many would call your guardian angel. There was a beat of silence. My guardian angel, said Will. Then she's a supernatural being? Supernatural, Jeremy murmured. A strange term. A logical impossibility, of course. But I understand your meaning. Is she actually an angel? Asked Emily. The term guardian angel is a broad one, generally used to describe the role played by the being, not necessarily her particular nature, he explained. Such guardians are always otherworldly, sometimes deities, but usually lesser beings. In your case, my young friend, it seems you have a powerful patron, a full-fledged goddess looking out for you. Will had many questions, but he began with, why? Why do I believe she is a goddess? Jeremy asked him. No, he said, though he was curious about that as well. Why would such a being, or any being for that matter, be concerned with my welfare? Jeremy crossed his arms on his chest and looked Will in the eye. Why indeed, he responded. But why wasn't Will able to sense what she was? Emily inquired. Maybe not her specific role as his guardian, but at least that she was a foreign creature. Yes, said Jeremy. A good question. I think the answer is that his instincts were correct, for she is not. Emily looked puzzled by his statement. Not what? She asked. She seems to be native to his world, because she was always here, he answered. In a sense. Do you mean she's my creation? Will asked. No, he said. She came here with you. She was a part of your life before you created this world. It took Will a moment to realize what he meant. Are you saying that Iris was with me, was my guardian angel, in the waking world? That's my belief, said Jeremy. You may not have seen her. You may never have been aware of her presence, consciously at least. Nevertheless, there is a good chance she has been at your side and has come to your aid throughout your life. But she showed herself to me here in Wysteria, said Will. Why? Because she can, he replied. And in the waking world, she can't? Jeremy stared at the stone floor in front of him, his brow furrowed, as if considering how to answer. Then, after mumbling something unintelligible, he stood up straight, turned around, and looked down into the canyon. Emily took Will by the arm and pulled him over to a nearby bench, where they sat and waited for him to continue, or not. Jeremy finally spoke, making up for his short, enigmatic answers by delivering what turned out to be a rather lengthy and enlightening, if somewhat rambling, speech. When we look at a rainbow, we see a range of hues, he began. Though it is a continuous spectrum, we can delineate specific colors: red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, and violet. This is what our mortal eyes can perceive. But this is not where the rainbow stops. It goes on in both directions, beyond the red and the violet. Other bands of color, just as distinct and equally as beautiful, but invisible to us. We can imagine a being, perhaps one more primitive than we, having eyes with a narrower range of perception, unable to see the 7 bands of color, but perhaps only 5 or 3 or 1. We could also imagine a being whose eyes had a wider range, eyes capable of detecting colors beyond these 7, just as dogs can hear high-pitched sounds that we cannot. There is another possibility as well. Beings whose eyes are no better or worse, but which detect a completely different spectrum of colors, higher or lower in wavelength. It's an imperfect analogy. However, let us imagine that the individual ribbons of color are worlds, are frequencies not of light, but of mind, each color representing a world we can access, a world within which we can live. Under normal circumstances, our minds are tuned to a single vibration. We see only the world of green, let us say, although, whether by accident or design, we sometimes catch faint glimpses of the other colors, briefly travel into the other worlds that surround us. Our ordinary dreams are such an occasion. Our minds become tuned to a lower frequency, and we enter another world. But the vibration fluctuates, and the world has no stability, unless one is a dreamer, of course. Though there is a set of worlds we can potentially enter, as there is a range of colors we can potentially see, there are many more, an infinite number perhaps, that we cannot. Like our eyesight, the mortal mind has limits. There are frequencies our minds cannot match. But the universe at large, by which I mean everything, the entire rainbow, so to speak, not only the small part we can see, is rich with other beings, other species of minds, each defined by their particular, distinct vibrational spectrum. After pouring out these words, Jeremy paused and took a deep breath. What he'd said was informative, even if he hadn't addressed Will's specific question. But Jeremy wasn't finished. It is possible for us to interact with these other species, he continued, but only when we are both in the same world, when our minds are tuned to the same vibration at the same time. Thus, there are beings we can interact with, and others that always remain hidden from us, those whose spectrum of possible vibrations does not overlap at any point with ours. Though hesitant to interrupt, Will couldn't resist. If they're always hidden from us, then how do we know these beings exist, he asked. Primarily from second-hand accounts, Jeremy replied. There are humans who are not within your circle of friends, and whom you've never met, yet you know of their existence, and perhaps many details about them, because they are friends of friends. And I should not have said that these beings are always hidden, for they, or we, do occasionally cross into these normally inaccessible worlds. The color spectrum analogy is useful, but as I noted, imperfect, for it suggests that these highly foreign worlds, are farther away in distance. Instead, for the moment, though the comparison is equally deficient, let us think of worlds as musical notes, vibrations of a certain frequency, and minds, or beings, as the instruments that produce them. A correctly tuned piano can play only certain notes. Like the visible rainbow, the keyboard has an upper and lower limit. However, there are other notes it cannot play. The notes in between the keys. Under normal conditions, they are unplayable, though not because they are beyond the range of the keyboard. And yet, a piano can go out of tune, and these hidden notes can then reveal themselves. But, unlike the frequencies that are too high or too low for our instrument to produce, these vibrations are always discordant, yielding sounds unpleasant to our ears. Jeremy now turned and faced the couple. "These are the worlds of madness," he said. "These are the worlds into which the insane have drifted. And these are the worlds from which toxic beings emerge." And that concludes part 1, and we will return immediately with part 2.